wind that moved across the plains of Central Europe in early 1241 carried with it no warning that could be understood. There were no proclamations, no formal declarations of war, no envoys bearing threats, only fragments of rumor, burned towns far to the east, riders who did not stop, armies that did not behave like armies. By the time these whispers reached the courts of Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, they were already too late to matter. What approached was not merely another invading force. It was a system of war that Europe had never encountered, precise, disciplined, and terrifyingly indifferent to distance, weather, or expectation. The campaign that would culminate at the Battle of Legnica did not begin in Poland. It began years earlier, far beyond the forests and rivers that defined the European frontier, deep within the expanding domain of the Mongol Empire. Under the direction of Orda Khan, the empire had already reshaped the political geography of Asia. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in weeks. Armies that relied on walls and weight were dismantled by speed and coordination. But Europe remained, in Mongol eyes, unfinished. The invasion of Eastern Europe was not an impulsive raid. It was a coordinated strategic movement led by commanders who had already demonstrated an ability to operate across vast distances with synchronized precision. Among them was Orda Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and the General Subutai, a man whose campaigns had already spanned thousands of miles and dozens of battlefields. Their objective was not simply conquest in the conventional sense. It was the systematic neutralization of resistance. As Mongol forces advanced westward, they did so along multiple axes. This was not accidental. It was designed to fracture communication between European rulers, to prevent the formation of a unified defensive response. While Orda Khan pressed toward Hungary, another force moved into Poland. The intention was clear: divide the defenders, isolate their armies, and destroy them before they could combine. In early 1241, Poland stood exposed. The political landscape of the region was fragmented. Authority was divided among regional dukes, each responsible for his own territory, each aware of the growing threat, but uncertain of its scale. Among them, one figure began to emerge as a focal point of resistance: Henry II the Pious. Henry was not a king, but he understood the implications of what was unfolding. Reports arriving from the east described something that did not align with traditional warfare. Entire settlements were disappearing. Sent to investigate did not return. Survivors spoke of enemies who avoided direct confrontation, who struck unexpectedly, and who vanished before retaliation could be organized. For a European commander trained in the conventions of feudal warfare, this presented a fundamental problem. Strategy relied on predictability, on the expectation that an enemy would seek decisive engagement, that battles would be fought in defined spaces, and that victory would come through direct confrontation. The Mongols offered none of these assurances. Henry began to gather forces, drawing knights and infantry from across Silesia and neighboring regions. Messages were sent to potential allies, including contingents from the Holy Roman Empire and military orders such as the Knights Templar. The response was uneven, but not insignificant. Men came, some out of obligation, others out of conviction that the threat required action. Yet even as these forces assembled, the nature of the enemy remained unclear. The Mongol advance into Poland was marked by a sequence of rapid, localized strikes. Towns were attacked not as strategic objectives, but as instruments of disruption. Each assault created panic, displaced populations, and severed lines of communication. European commanders struggled to determine where the main force was, or where it would strike next. This uncertainty was not incidental. It was deliberate. Mongol reconnaissance operated continuously, mapping terrain, observing troop movements, and identifying weaknesses. Their intelligence network extended far beyond what European armies could match. By the time a Polish force moved to defend one location, Mongol units had often already withdrawn, only to reappear elsewhere. The effect was cumulative. Confusion began to replace coordination. Henry faced a narrowing window. If he waited too long, the invading forces would continue to dismantle the region piece by piece. If he acted too early, he risked confronting an enemy whose strength and disposition he did not fully understand. He chose to act. The decision was shaped not only by necessity, but by the logic of European warfare. To defeat an invading force, one had to bring it to battle, to force a decisive engagement, where numbers, armor, and discipline could be brought to bear. Henry's army, composed largely of heavily armored knights supported by infantry, was built for precisely this kind of confrontation. But this assumption that the enemy could be fixed in place and defeated through direct engagement was the first point of divergence between European and Mongol strategy. As Henry's forces began to concentrate near the town of Legnica, the Mongols continued their advance, but with calculated restraint. They did not rush to meet the assembled army. Instead, they maintained distance, probing, observing, and shaping the conditions under which the battle would occur. This was not hesitation. It was preparation. The terrain around Legnica offered a mixture of open ground and subtle elevation changes suitable, from a European perspective, for cavalry engagement. For the Mongols, it presented opportunities for maneuver and deception. Every movement was evaluated not in isolation, but as part of a broader sequence designed to control the flow of the coming battle. Meanwhile, the psychological dimension of the campaign deepened. Refugees arriving at Henry's camp brought stories that defied expectation. They spoke of riders who could shoot accurately at full speed, of feigned retreats that lured pursuers into traps, of smoke and noise used to create confusion on the battlefield. Some accounts were exaggerated, but the underlying reality was consistent. This enemy did not behave according to known patterns. Within the ranks of Henry's army, confidence coexisted with uncertainty. The knights, bound by a culture that emphasized courage and direct action, believed in the superiority of their armor and their charge. Many had faced enemies before and prevailed. Yet beneath this confidence was a growing awareness that they were preparing to fight something fundamentally different. Command cohesion was also a concern. The assembled forces represented multiple regions and interests. Coordination depended on shared understanding, but such understanding was limited. Orders would need to be issued clearly and executed quickly, conditions that are difficult to maintain even under ideal circumstances. The Mongols, by contrast, operated within a unified command structure. Their units were trained to respond to signals and pre-arranged plans, allowing for coordinated movement across distances that would challenge most armies. Discipline was not merely enforced, it was embedded. As the two forces moved closer to confrontation, the contrast between them became increasingly pronounced. On one side stood an army built around the principle of decisive engagement, seeking to bring overwhelming force to bear in a single, defining moment. On the other stood a force designed to avoid such moments unless they occurred on its own terms. The stage was being set, not through a single movement, but through a sequence of calculated decisions. Each reconnaissance patrol, each feigned withdrawal, each delayed engagement contributed to an environment in which clarity was diminished and pressure increased. Henry could not wait indefinitely. To delay further risked allowing the Mongols to continue their disruption unchecked. To engage meant stepping into a battle whose parameters were already being shaped by the enemy. By early April 1241, the convergence was inevitable. The fields near Legnica would soon become the point at which two fundamentally different approaches to warfare collided, one rooted in tradition and expectation, the other in adaptation and control. Neither side entered the coming battle without purpose. But only one side had already determined how it would unfold. By the morning of April 9, 1241, the uncertainty that had defined the campaign began to narrow into something more immediate. The armies that had spent weeks maneuvering, probing, and interpreting one another's intentions were now within reach of decisive contact. The open ground near Legnica, quiet, unremarkable, and deceptively simple, was about to become a controlled environment shaped not by terrain alone, but by timing, discipline, and perception. Henry II's force had grown into a composite army, assembled under pressure and bound by necessity rather than long-term cohesion. At its core were heavily armored knights, mounted warriors trained for shock combat, protected by chainmail and reinforced with shields, helmets, and lances designed for a single, decisive impact. Around them gathered infantry levies, local militias, and smaller contingents drawn from neighboring regions. Among these were experienced fighters, including members of military orders, but they operated within a structure that had not been tested together under unified command. The army's strength lay in its capacity for concentrated force. A coordinated charge by armored cavalry could shatter less organized opponents. This had been proven repeatedly across European battlefields, but such effectiveness depended on conditions, clear lines of sight, stable formations, and an enemy willing or forced to stand and receive the blow. The Mongol force approaching Legnica had no intention of providing such conditions. Under the operational influence of Subutai and regional command directed by Baidar and Kadan, the Mongol detachment in Poland was not large by the standards of their empire, estimated at perhaps 10 to 15,000 men. Yet its size was misleading. This was not a mass levy. It was a field force composed of highly trained cavalry, structured into units capable of independent maneuver, while remaining synchronized through signaling systems that coordinated movement across the battlefield. Every soldier was mounted. Every soldier was mobile. Their equipment reflected their doctrine. Composite bows, compact yet powerful, allowed accurate fire at distances and angles unfamiliar to European archers. Multiple remounts ensured sustained mobility, allowing units to advance, withdraw, and reposition without exhaustion. Armor, while lighter than that of European knights, was sufficient to protect against glancing blows without sacrificing speed. Most critically, their training emphasized coordination over individual valor. As dawn progressed, initial contact began not with a full engagement, but with probing movements. Mongol advance elements appeared within sight of Henry's army, maintaining distance while observing reactions. These were not skirmishes intended to achieve immediate tactical gain. They were measurements, tests of timing, response, and command cohesion. Henry's commanders faced a familiar but uncomfortable question: when to commit? To remain stationary risked ceding initiative. To advance prematurely risked disorganization. Yet the presence of the enemy, visible and within reach, exerted pressure. The expectation of battle, once proximity was established, was difficult to delay. The first significant movements came from the European side. Forward elements, including lighter cavalry and infantry, began to push outward, attempting to engage the Mongol skirmishers. The response was immediate and consistent with established Mongol practice. The forward units withdrew deliberately, steadily, and without visible disorder. To a European observer, this resembled hesitation, perhaps even weakness. It was neither. The withdrawal was controlled, maintaining just enough distance to avoid direct engagement while encouraging pursuit. Arrows were loosed intermittently, not in massed volleys, but in targeted shots designed to disrupt formations and provoke reaction. Horses shifted direction with fluid precision, turning what appeared to be retreat into a managed extension of the battlefield. Henry's forces advanced further. At this stage, the cohesion of the army began to stretch. Different contingents moved at different speeds. Communication, reliant on messengers and visual signals, struggled to keep pace with the evolving situation. Dust began to rise from the ground, obscuring visibility and adding another layer of uncertainty. The Mongols had anticipated this. As European units pressed forward, Mongol detachments began to extend along the flanks. These movements were subtle, executed at distance, and partially concealed by terrain and dust. The intention was not yet to encircle, but to shape the space, widening the engagement zone and increasing the difficulty of maintaining a unified front. Then came the first decisive escalation. A larger Mongol formation appeared to falter under pressure, withdrawing more rapidly than before. The opportunity seemed clear. Elements of the European cavalry, including heavily armored knights, accelerated into pursuit, seeking to convert momentum into breakthrough. This was the moment the Mongols had been constructing. The retreating units did not break, they divided. At prearranged points, smaller groups veered off, opening corridors through which pursuing forces were drawn deeper into the field. At the same time, previously uncommitted Mongol units, positioned beyond immediate sight, began to converge. Arrows intensified. Unlike earlier probing shots, these were coordinated volleys, delivered from multiple directions. The effect was disorienting. Knights, encased in armor designed to withstand direct impact, found themselves targeted from angles that armor did not fully protect. Horses, less protected and more vulnerable, became primary targets. A fallen horse did not merely remove mobility, it disrupted formation and exposed the rider. The European advance slowed, then fragmented. Within this shifting environment, command clarity began to erode. Signals were misinterpreted or not seen. Units that had advanced rapidly now found themselves isolated, their flanks exposed without clear support. Attempts to regroup were complicated by the constant movement of the enemy, who refused to remain fixed long enough for a stable line to be re-established. Henry II had to maintain control, directing reserves and issuing orders to stabilize the front, but each decision was made within a narrowing window of reliable information. What could be seen directly was often misleading. What could not be seen carried greater risk. The Mongols exploited this asymmetry. Their signaling system, using flags, horns, and prearranged commands, allowed coordinated shifts in formation that appeared, to their opponents, as sudden and unpredictable changes. Units that had been engaged would disengage, replaced by fresh forces. Pressure was applied, then released, then applied again from a different direction. Fatigue began to set in, not only physical, but cognitive. For the European soldiers, the battle did not conform to expectation. There was no clear line to hold, no single point at which to concentrate force. Instead, there was constant motion, intermittent contact, and a growing sense that the enemy was dictating the rhythm of engagement. At a critical point, a new element was introduced. Sources described the use of smoke, likely generated through burning materials, deployed in a way that further obscured visibility. Whether intended primarily for concealment or psychological effect, its impact was significant. Combined with dust and movement, it reduced the ability of commanders to assess the battlefield in real time. In this environment, even disciplined units struggled to maintain cohesion. The Mongols began to tighten their control. What had started as a series of withdrawals and probes transitioned into a more structured encirclement, not a complete ring, but a series of overlapping zones of pressure that limited movement and increased vulnerability. European units attempting to withdraw encountered resistance. Those attempting to advance found the enemy receding, only to reappear on their flanks. The battlefield had been transformed. It was no longer a space for decisive collision. It had become a managed system of movement, in which one side operated with increasing constraint, and the other with sustained flexibility. Henry's army was still intact, but its advantages, mass, armor, and shock capability, were no longer aligned with the conditions of the fight. Each attempt to impose structure was met with evasion. Each effort to concentrate force resulted in further dispersion. The engagement had reached a point where outcome would depend not on a single decisive action, but on the cumulative effect of many smaller interactions, each shaped by the same underlying dynamic. Control had shifted. And with that shift, the possibility of recovery began to narrow. By the time the battle approached its final phase, the outcome had not yet been declared, but its direction had already been set. What remained of Henry II's army was no longer operating as a unified force. The fragmentation that had begun during the initial pursuit had deepened into structural collapse. Units that had once advanced in confidence were now reacting in isolation, attempting to interpret a battlefield that no longer followed any recognizable pattern. The Mongols had not overwhelmed the army through direct impact. They had reshaped the conditions under which the army functioned, removing cohesion, distorting perception, and forcing decisions to be made with incomplete understanding. At this stage, the critical factor was no longer strength, but control. Henry II the Pious, remained on the field, attempting to stabilize what could still be stabilized. His position required him to make decisions within an environment where reliable information was scarce. Reports from the front conflicted with visible developments. Signals were delayed, obscured, or misinterpreted. The battlefield had become an unreliable system. Yet withdrawal was not a simple option. To disengage from a mobile enemy required coordination that no longer existed. Units attempting to pull back risked exposing themselves further as the Mongols continued to apply pressure from shifting directions. Retreat, under these conditions, could accelerate collapse rather than prevent it. The Mongols understood this dynamic precisely. Their movements began to narrow not into a rigid encirclement, but into a tightening series of controlled engagements. Each maneuver reduced the available space in which European forces could operate effectively. Gaps between units widened. Attempts to regroup became more difficult, then nearly impossible. At the same time, the tempo of attack increased. Where earlier phases of the battle had emphasized movement and probing, the final phase introduced sustained pressure. Mongol cavalry units, rotating in and out of engagement, maintained a continuous presence. Fresh riders replaced those who had already expended arrows or endurance, ensuring that the intensity of attack did not diminish. This continuity was decisive. European forces, by contrast, had no such rotation system. Fatigue accumulated without relief. Horses, already strained by repeated charges and abrupt maneuvers, began to fail. Armor that had once provided confidence now contributed to exhaustion. limiting mobility at precisely the moment when mobility was most needed. Within this imbalance, localized collapses began to occur. A contingent isolated from its support would find itself under concentrated attack arrows from multiple directions, followed by close engagement once cohesion had broken. These were not large, singular breakthroughs. They were incremental failures, each one removing another piece of the larger structure. Over time, these losses compounded. Command authority, already weakened, began to dissolve at the edges. Leaders could no longer rely on consistent communication with adjacent units. Decisions that might have been effective within a coordinated framework lost their impact when executed in isolation. The battlefield, once expansive, now felt constrained not by physical barriers, but by the narrowing range of viable options. At some point during this phase, Henry II committed his remaining reserves. The intention was clear: to reassert control, to create a point of stability from which the rest of the army could reorganize. In traditional European warfare, such a commitment could reverse momentum, especially if timed against an overextended enemy. But the Mongols were not overextended. They adjusted. As the reserve advanced, Mongol units withdrew just enough to absorb the impact without breaking. Then, as before, they reconfigured, shifting pressure to the flanks, isolating the advancing force from what remained behind it. The reserve, instead of restoring cohesion, became another fragment within the larger system of dislocation. This marked the final transition. What followed was not a sudden rout, but a gradual unraveling. Pockets of resistance continued, some maintaining discipline, even as surrounding units fell away. Knights dismounted or separated from their formations fought with the means available to them. But without coordination, such resistance could not alter the broader outcome. The Mongols closed distance where appropriate, but they did not abandon their method. Even in the final stages, they avoided unnecessary risk, maintaining patterns of engagement that minimized exposure while maximizing pressure. Henry II was killed during this phase. The precise circumstances remain uncertain, shaped by accounts that differ in detail. What is consistent is the effect. His death removed the central figure around whom any remaining cohesion might have formed. In an army already strained by fragmentation, this loss accelerated the transition from disorganization to collapse. Without central command, resistance became localized and temporary. The field near Legnica, which had begun the day as a point of convergence, became a space of dispersal. Survivors attempted to withdraw, some successfully, others intercepted. The Mongols did not pursue indiscriminately. Their objective had been achieved, not annihilation for its own sake, but the neutralization of a force capable of organized resistance. By the end of the engagement, the disparity between expectation and outcome was complete. An army that had relied on mass, armor, and decisive engagement had been dismantled by a force that avoided those very conditions. The numerical imbalance, often cited in later accounts, obscures the more significant factor: the difference in operational design. The Mongols did not defeat a larger army through superior strength alone. They did so by controlling how and where that strength could be applied. In the aftermath, the consequences extended beyond the battlefield. The defeat at the Battle of Legnica removed one of the primary defensive concentrations in the region. It reinforced the perception, already forming, that the Mongol advance was not easily contained by conventional means. Reports of the battle spread westward, often amplified, contributing to a broader sense of vulnerability. Yet the Mongols did not continue indefinitely into Western Europe. Their campaign, though successful, was part of a larger strategic framework. Developments within the Mongol Empire, including the death of Orda Khan, required the return of key power and commanders to participate in the selection of a new Great Khan. This shift redirected the focus of the campaign, limiting further expansion at that moment. The field at Legnica remained. What it represented, however, was not simply a defeat. It was an encounter between two systems of warfare, one rooted in established tradition, the other in adaptive control. The outcome did not render European methods obsolete, but it exposed their limitations when confronted by an opponent operating under fundamentally different assumptions. In the years that followed, these lessons would be studied, adapted, and in some cases, misunderstood. But on that day in 1241, the lesson was immediate and irreversible. Victory had not belonged to the larger force, nor to the more heavily armored, nor to the side that sought battle most directly. It had belonged to the side that determined how the battle would be fought, and ensured that every decision made by its opponent unfolded within that design.